All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the French and Indian War. I hope you enjoyed The Last of the Mohicans. I'm pretty excited about this process to try this new technology, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be here with you, but at least I get to be here in spirit. Kind of cool, huh? Anyway, the French and Indian War, I just wanted to make sure you guys had a good comprehension of how this whole thing shook down and the process of it. So anyway, on the back of your study guide, you're going to have this key that you can follow along and make sure that, again, you have all the details that you need to understand. All right, let's get started. Obviously, we talked about North America and the fact that it had some huge issues by 1750, and you can see the disputed areas and everything that was going on right in here in this disputed region. Basically, you had the British that said that they controlled it, and the French said they controlled it. In the meantime, the Spanish were hanging out down here. And ultimately, this region is called the Ohio River Valley. Now, you saw in the movie that all the weak and poor people headed out into the frontier along the back country, and that was where pretty much there was a lot of issues because of the Native Americans that were over in this region. And what you found is that the British and the French wanted to make sure that each of them had a dominant power and control in the certain area. And by the time it was all said and done, what you had was a battle for empire, and it spilled over into the American colonies, and obviously you saw the relationship start to dwindle between the English and their colonial subjects. Why was the tension there? Like I said, Britain had claimed all the territory in America, basically from the East Coast, and then they also said to the West Coast. Unfortunately, the gap between the East Coast and the West Coast was filled in by the French, and the English didn't like that. Britain had really done a good job settling the colonies. They had 1.5 million people compared to the 70,000 French people that were living in Canada, pretty much in the north near Quebec. And they also wanted to control the fur trade. The British were getting greedy, and they saw that the French were taking some of the stuff that they felt they could make money on. In 1754 was pretty much the first clash. This is what really triggered and started the war. And if you look right here, this is Fort Duquesne. We read about that. And here you have Fort Necessity with being built by George Washington, and he gets introduced to the first time, and the British finally and the French clash together, and next thing you know, you have George Washington taking on a fight against the Delaware and the Shawnee Indians along with their French allies. He does get captured, he does get taken, and this is kind of the first event that triggers the war. Also in 1754, the Albany Plan of Union was created by Ben Franklin, and he tried to get all the colonies to come together and unify. And this would have been great had everybody listened to him. Unfortunately, they didn't, and naturally we wouldn't unify and come together until much later. But Ben Franklin had a good vision about what he thought should happen, and you can see the head of the snake. This was called a political cartoon of the time period, trying to get everybody on board. And it did fail. It didn't work out so well. And they used the example that the Iroquois had. The Iroquois Confederacy was a strong group of Indians that were tribes that actually unified together. They were the 5 civilized tribes. And basically New England is kind of the head of the snake with Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Connecticut. But New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Some of you are probably going, well, where's Georgia in all this? Well, remember, Georgia came in really late. They were still having issues trying to develop. So out of sight, out of mind. The Iroquois would break off their relations with Britain because they had threatened to trade with the French during this time, and so that kind of worried everybody, and they wanted to make sure they kept those Iroquois allies. And you saw in the movie the Last of the Mohicans that the Iroquois tribe is represented there. The Mohican people are part of that group. So anyway, you can see that not every Native American was on the same page with the other Native Americans around the group. In 1755, Braddock was the first to come out from the British, and he was led out there by George Washington. And of course, his job was to go out and evict the French from the Ohio River Valley in Canada, and part of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, which we talked about before. That's way up north above Maine. And he did attack the Ohio River Valley and Acadia. and that's where we get our Cajuns from. Unfortunately, he didn't go very far because he spent most of his time trying to build a road, and he was killed just 10 miles from Fort Duquesne. 1,500 French and Indian forces. The book gave us a smaller number, but he was attacked and killed. And really, Braddock's only success was that he got rid of the French in Louisiana and sent those that were in Acadia down into Louisiana, which we now know as the Cajun people. And obviously, we love their food. But in 1756, war is formally declared, and France and Britain would clash, in the 7 Years' War, and the Native American tribes would basically be exploited on both sides. Every party was involved on both sides. The Iroquois weren't sure which side they were going to be on, and some of them started to split up, but that played kind of a big role. But here's the key component of why the French and Indian War is so important. Remember, this is the first stone thrown in the pond. Imagine that clear, clean pond there. And the British and American colonial tensions were extremely high. Colonists had a whole different way of thinking about things, especially when it came to fighting. They used the Indian style of guerrilla tactics, whereas the British used their old school march in formation, bayonet charges, and dominate with power and just sheer size. When it came to military organization, again, the Americans were colonial militias. They were volunteers. They served under their own captains. They definitely were not going to answer to anything British. They didn't like that. On the other hand, the British were trained officers. They wanted to take charge of the colonials, and whatever they told them to do is what they did. And they didn't like the fact that the Americans stopped for themselves and did their own thing. And you guys saw that hopefully in the film. They did a really good job, trying to go out and recruit them. The very first scene that I really like to emphasize for you guys is the scene where they're at the town, kind of the town barbecue, essentially, is what we'd call it today. And really, trying to recruit that group of Indians and the settlers. They're all poor people that are like, why should we fight with you? And we need to protect our families and take care of our homes. And and he said, well, that for king and country, that's why you're to do this. And everybody's like, well, that may be why you do it, but it's not why we do it. And the English didn't understand that. They had to make terms for the crown, and that was stuff that just was unacceptable. Military discipline, obviously, the colonials have no military discipline. Very indifferent about how they do stuff. Their protocols are not observed. They don't follow any order, and they don't dress in uniforms. And whereas the British are all about drills and being tough and disciplined, and that was really difficult for the British to try to understand about the Americans. Finances. Resistance to raising taxes. The colonists didn't want to pay for this. They felt like this is a European war. They just happened to be fighting in America. Whereas the British believed that since they're fighting in America, that the colonists should pay for everything. Obviously, that's going to be a problem. Their demeanor, Americans were very casual and non-professional. Again, it's about hacking it out with their own two hands and living a rough life and just trying to survive. Whereas the British are all prima donnas, British officers have servants and tea settings, and everything's got to be perfect. And again, that'll lead to their demise much later. By 1757, William Pitt becomes the foreign minister, which basically means that he represents England in America. And he's a good guy. He understood colonial concerns. He offered them a compromise early on, and he basically said, hey, we want your loyalty and we need your military support. But the British, as what we're going to do is we promise to reimburse the colonial assemblies for all their costs. So that was kind of a deal he made them, and some of that had to do, or dealings had to do with giving land out into the West. And again, this is part of the big issue that the king doesn't like to have to deal with. The results, colonial morale increases by 1758, which is good. So William Pitt's kind of a good guy, which is why we have places like Pittsburgh, and why Fort Pitt changes its name from Fort Duquesne to Fort Pitt. So we like William Pitt. Oh, sorry, that's in the wrong place. In 1758 and 1761, the tide turns for England. By 1761, Spain has become an ally of France, and that becomes a problem. Spain starts to help out France, And so if the French lose, guess what? Spain's going to pay a price for that. And next thing you know, that's exactly what happens. Spain helped out the French, and they lost. So when that happens, guess what? We take stuff from Spain, and they get something back. And it kind of worked out politically for everybody, except France, of course. So the battle for New France, cutting off the French at sea was the first blow. That was the key. Taking the capital of New France was the second goal. And General Montcalm is defeated, which we read about on the Plains of Abraham, after they snuck up the back walls of this gigantic cliff and during the night, and it protected Quebec. And eventually Montreal would fall shortly after Quebec. And pretty much that was the end of the war. I don't need to get into too many details, but I do want you to understand the big picture here. The Treaty of Paris is probably the most important thing that comes out of this war. The French would lose everything for the most part. They got a few fishing rights, and that was about it. But they lost their entire empire, including places in India. I mean, remember, this is the 7 Years' War. It just took place, part of it took place in America. The rest was around the world. The Spain, they helped out the losing side. And you help out the losing side, guess what? You're going to have to give something up. And so Spain gave up Florida to England. In return, they got all of the lands west of the Mississippi River. So that was a big deal for them. And England, well, they got everything. They got all the French lands in Canada, exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade, and commercial dominance in India. And again, they also got Florida. So England really kind of dominated this. Unfortunately, the Americans didn't get a whole lot in return. Instead, they got boundary changes. And you can see here's a new picture of everything that was gained by Great Britain. What did the effects have on Britain? Well, it increased their colonial empire, which means now they've got more territory to govern. Greatly enlarged England's debt. You go into debt fighting wars, which is kind of the issues we're having now in America. We're having our own debt with the wars that we're in. And Britain's contempt for the colonials created bitter feelings. All of a sudden, Great Britain's like, you know what, these Americans, they need to be doing what they're told. They need to be paying their bills. They're ours. They're our subjects, and they need to appreciate us. And so that became kind of an attitude. Therefore, England felt that the major reorganization of her American empire was necessary, which means no more salutary, everybody say it, neglect. So hopefully you said that. But basically now it's time for them to focus on America. So some of the effects that the war would have on the colonials, well, it united them against a common enemy for the first time. They rose up against the French together, and they realized that that's possible, and they're capable of that. It created socializing experiment for all the colonials who participated. Again, very positive thing. And all of a sudden it created bitter feelings towards the British, and we saw that from the movie. You saw that the Americans were bitter about how the English were treating them and not giving them the respect that they deserved, and it just got really ugly for them. In the meantime, obviously there's tensions that arise, and that is what causes the problems. Pontiac's Rebellion. What about all the Native Americans who were on both sides of the war? Well, they rise up and they start fighting, and they end up at places like Fort Detroit. And the British use biological weapon against them and try to infect them with smallpox. And England thought that it was easier to keep the colonials out of the territory rather than protect them. And after Pontiac's Rebellion and his raid, and look at all the attacks that Pontiac's Indians made on all the different British forts that were out there and the colonials that were trying to live now in the Ohio River Valley. Things got really ugly. And because of that, the king decided, you know what? It's much easier for us to just create a proclamation line to make sure that no one else passes over this boundary. And so now the colonials are stuck on this side of the Appalachian Mountains. And that's what really causes that first ripple in the pond to get kind of ugly. And so that was kind of the turning point. And the colonial relationships are going to be extremely tense from here on out. And ultimately, that's what I wanted to teach you. So hopefully by the time it's all said and done, you feel confident about what you know and what you're going to be doing. And this is your in the hole for the day. And you started a new in the hole today, and this is your in the hole, or off the tees and in the holes, and now you have a new in the hole. And you have your study guide, and you know what you need to study. So I hope that this has clarified some things for you, and good luck on your test, and I will see you guys next week when I get back. Enjoy.